While the recent New York Times hit piece was a brutal takedown of Bob Iger, it still pulled its punches in a major way, as it, quite conveniently some might say, ignored some larger corporate governance issues that shareholders should be deeply concerned about. Issues that might have legal repercussions, up to and including jail time. What are these issues, and why would the New York Times refrain from commenting on them? Let's find out. This video is sponsored by Fume. However embarrassing the New York Times hit piece may be for Bob Iger, he and the entirety of Disney's board should take solace in that the New York Times restricted themselves to exposing Iger's narcissism and vindictiveness, as however petty this may be, it is not strictly illegal. They stopped short of exposing anything outright illegal that involved anyone other than Bob Iger. They did, however, dance around a much larger issue, and by juxtaposing what the New York Times just revealed with what CNBC exposed last year, we're gonna shine a light on what. And you're gonna be tempted to light a cigarette for that. You really shouldn't though, as neither smoking, nor for that matter vaping, are good for you, and there is a so much better alternative, namely flavored air. That's right, flavored air. It's a whole movement towards better habits, and it's led by Fume, the sponsor of this video. If you haven't heard about flavored air before, then think of it this way. If vaping is a sticky soda, then flavored air is herbal tea, and Fume is an award-winning flavored air device. It looks awesome with a weighted, high-quality design. It's made to be fidgeted with, complete with soothing snaps and clicks, thus filling the void of any habit you may want to ditch. Fume has lots of delicious flavors to choose from, like crisp mint, my personal favorite, as well as orange vanilla, another popular choice. There's no vapor, so you can use it anywhere, and obviously there's no addictive nicotine. On the contrary, Fume continuously invests in third-party studies to ensure the safety of their products. And what is more, Fume is backed by doctors in the US. With flavored air, you can satisfy your fixation through a passive diffusion system that utilizes no electronics, no batteries, no vapor, and no combustion. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. For a limited time, use our code Midnight's Edge to get your free topper. It's the perfect accessory to your Fume device. Slip it onto the mouthpiece for a softer, warmer feel. It's chewable for those who love to fidget, and it's reusable. Head to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code Midnight's Edge, or scan the QR code on screen to get your free Fume topper when you order your Journey Pack today. Thanks to Fume for sponsoring this video, and with that, let's begin with some select quotes from the New York Times article to see how they dance around an issue of, shall we say, highly questionable legality. Let's begin with how Iger decided to appoint Chapek as CEO in name only to deal with all the boring number stuff, while Iger dealt with all the cool celebrity stuff and premieres and galas. Indeed, the New York Times writes, there were aspects of the job that Mr. Iger didn't especially enjoy, like earnings presentations and being grilled by Wall Street analysts. He had grown tired of budget meetings, and one of Disney's directors, Mark Parker, had recently decided to step down as chief executive of Nike and become executive chairman. Mr. Iger pitched doing the same thing. That model would allow him to stay at Disney for the remainder of his contract, doing what he liked best, overseeing the company's creative endeavors. Mr. Chapek would become the CEO and handle everything else. So, in other words, we have a CEO that doesn't want to do the work of a CEO. He just wants to attend celebrity parties. When Mr. Iger stepped down as chief executive, abruptly, just weeks before the coronavirus pandemic plunged Disney into the worst crisis in its history, the company's board agreed that he could stay on as creative director and executive chairman of the board for another 2 years. The key takeaway here is that the board agreed to let Iger do what he wanted to do, which no functional board ever should have done. What a functional board should do to any CEO that wants to ditch the boring but vital part of their job, yet keep the fun, non-essential parts, while still remaining in control, is fire that delusional twat on the spot and immediately begin the search for a new CEO that can do all parts of the job. Because remember, it's the fiduciary responsibility of the board to find a CEO that will maximize shareholder value and follow up and ensure that he actually does. But instead, this board let Iger have his way, and they even let him find his own replacement CEO, though there was some very minor resistance along the way. The New York Times writes, Safra Katz, the chief executive of Oracle and a Disney board member, pushed back. Why make Mr. Chapek chief executive rather than chief operating officer? Because really, that is what Iger wanted in a traditional sense, to shift most of his responsibilities over to an Uber COO while he went out to party. Some board members had reservations. The article reads, but in a rare show of resistance, the board was unpersuaded. It agreed to consider the issue over the holidays. Again, the New York Times highlights that it's rare for the board to show any kind of resistance to Iger. The little resistance that wouldn't last long though. The article continues, by the time board members met in late January 2020 in LA, they had come around. So, a couple of weeks later, after some time away from work, they all suddenly agreed with Iger. Could it be that there was some kind of communication going on between Iger and resistant board members outside of working hours? It would have been really bad if that were to have happened, but the New York Times doesn't say that it did. Only that the entire board all of a sudden came around to do the most unconventional thing that Iger wanted, and accepted his choice for new CEO, with no vetting process whatsoever, just as the lockdowns were about to hit. Surely this is a violation of the board's fiduciary responsibilities towards the shareholders. Why were they in such a rush that they couldn't vet a new CEO, which is like half the reason the board is there in the first place? The New York Times continues. David Jefferson, a Disney spokesman, said the pandemic had nothing to do with the timing of the leadership change. Board members agree, but when pressed, offer no explanation for the haste other than that was what Mr. Iger wanted. Again, that's what Mr. Iger wanted. We see this theme recur throughout the entire article, the board time and again bending over backwards to what Mr. Iger wanted. Except it's not their job to bend over backwards to Mr. Iger. Quite the contrary, they are legally bound by their fiduciary duties to at all times stand up to him and ensure that everything he does is in the best interest of the shareholders. If the CEO has a problem with that, then it is the duty of the board to fire that CEO and find a new one who understands that he is the servant of the shareholders, and that the board is appointed by the shareholders for the explicit purpose of overseeing the CEO and protecting shareholder interest. What the New York Times piece, in my opinion, is dancing around is that in what common sense should tell you is a blatant violation of fiduciary duties. Disney's board doesn't do this. Let's now go back to what the superior CNBC article said about this last year, and our earlier reporting based on it, and why the board allowed Iger to have his way with so little resistance. The article reads, by 2019, Iger had personally selected every member of the board, which is surprisingly lacking in media and entertainment experience. Iger is personally close with several of them, including Nike executive chairman Mark Parker and General Motors CEO Mary Barra. In addition, the wife of another director, Michael Froman, then vice chairman of MasterCard and now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, had been housemates with Iger's wife, Willow Bay, at the University of Pennsylvania. Functionally, this means that Disney does not have a board, and this is a pretty major deal. Normally, the board are the ones ultimately in charge of the company. They represent the shareholders, the owners, and it's their job to hire the CEO, tell him what he is expected to do, monitor that he does it in a satisfactory manner, and if he does not, replace him with someone more suitable for the job. That is what the board is supposed to do, but the board can't do that when Iger has stacked it with his friends and sycophants. With the exception of major institutional investors like BlackRock, Iger answers to no one, and isn't so much the CEO of Disney so much as he is the dictator of Disney. And all of a sudden, without warning, that dictator decided he needed to step down as CEO, appoint someone else, yet still retain control. Furthermore, this happened so suddenly it took even his closest peers at Disney by complete surprise. No one, of course, knows for certain why Iger was in such an incredible rush to get Chapek in as CEO, just as the lockdowns were about to hit. Though, while the New York Times completely bypassed the fact that Disney is a company without a functional board, I will credit them for doing something else that CNBC did not do, namely emphasize that Bob Iger is a party man. And to be clear, then I don't just mean as in that he likes to hang out in celebrity parties, but that he is an apparatchik, and such a senior one at that he even has influence over policy decisions. The New York Times writes, Governor Gavin Newsom called Mr. Iger before announcing that he would restrict public gatherings in California because of COVID. But he thought Disneyland might stay open. The governor didn't want people to panic, and he feared they might if Disneyland closed. Mr. Iger argued to Mr. Newsom that keeping the theme park open was a bad idea, given the health risks to both guests and employees. Mr. Newsom later publicly praised Mr. Iger's advice and cooperation. You gotta wonder if Iger would have been equally eager to close down the Disney parks if he still had been the CEO of the company. But with Chapek appointed CEO in name only just 2 weeks prior to this phone call, Iger's track record would remain unblemished, even if the parks closed. The New York Times continues, Mr. Chapek didn't disagree with the decision to close the parks, but he was furious that Mr. Iger had excluded him. The decision had nothing to do with Mr. Iger's creative mandate. Disney's executives worried about the shock that the park closures would have on the company's cash flow. Ms. McCarthy and Mr. Chapek made the decision to quickly furlough, albeit with health benefits, more than 90,000 employees at the theme parks. But Mr. Iger overruled them. He decided to wait until the government passed a COVID relief bill. Again, the New York Times doesn't state this, but it stands to reason that Iger would have had the knowledge of such a bill and may even have helped shape it. Either way, this is ugly. Not only is there a connection between the Supreme Emperor of Disney and the Democrat Party, which may run counter to shareholder interest. The shareholders have no idea what is going on, as Disney's board is appointed by Iger and not the shareholders. The only shareholders with any insight are the ones from BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, and others whose interests align more with the Democrat Party than any of the other shareholders, who incidentally are the ones who are screwed over here. Indeed, that was what Nelson Peltz's proxy fight was all about, but he was rebuffed. We've learned this from 2 separate news articles covering the same story, but from 2 slightly different angles 1 year apart, which I think may have something to do with what has been omitted and what is included in each. Let me emphasize that this is just my guess here, but I would imagine the reason why CNBC had no issue highlighting that Disney's board were all appointed by Iger is that CNBC is owned by Comcast, a corporate enemy of Disney. They might not have wanted to dig too closely into the ties between Iger and the Democrat Party though, because they have those ties as well. Case in point, when it comes to serving the Democrat agenda in the news, Comcast's CNBC is second only to Disney's ABC. I would also imagine the New York Times doesn't want to shine too much light on Disney's board dysfunction, because being so closely aligned with the interests being served by Disney's board themselves, they might not want to see that aspect of Disney change. So why write this hit piece against Iger at all, highlighting his party affiliation? My best guess is that he has either stepped on the toes of someone else in the party, or someone is trying to clear him out of the way for some other reason that may become clear in the future. Because there is no other reason why a propaganda outlet like the New York Times has become would write a hit piece on Bob Iger that mostly regurgitates what CNBC already put out there 1 full year ago. What do you make of all of this? Let me know in the comments, and before you go, remember that for a limited time, you can use our code Midnight'sEdge to get your free topper. It's the perfect accessory to your Fume device. Head to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code Midnight'sEdge, or scan the QR code on screen to get your free Fume topper when you order your Johnny Pack today.